Be sure to, there, I pressed the record button. I remember. I promised one of the participants of tonight's little group here about 4 years ago. At some point, I would use this these online classes to do a discussion of Judaism and the death penalty. And I'm happy to finally get to it. I'm going to talk probably for about 35, 40 minutes, but I will I'll stop a couple of times and look for questions. The most of this is over a PowerPoint presentation that I have right here. So the death penalty in Judaism. This is a very famous Mishnah, maybe the most famous Mishnah of all time, from the 4th chapter of Sanhedrin. And it says it was for this reason that man was first created as one person, Adam. Adam is singular, but Adam refers to all of humanity. And the sages say this is to teach you that anyone who destroys a life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world, and that anyone who saves a life as if he has saved an entire world. So this is very well known. What's less well known, I think, is the context of this Mishnah, which is tonight's subject. This sentence, this very famous phrase, is a charge that was read by the judges to witnesses in a capital case. That if somebody was going to give testimony that could have the effect of the death penalty being implied, the sages felt that they had to be aware of the tremendous gravity of this situation. And so we have this beautiful saying. This leads us, as we're going to say, the death penalty in Judaism draws out a certain paradox. The reason that people have the death penalty, the reason that people tend to support the death penalty, at least from the point of view of Judaism, flows from a belief that life is precious and that the destruction of human life can't be tolerated. But the penalty itself, the death penalty itself, involves the taking of a human life. And it's to go back and forth within this tension that is the drama of the death penalty in Jewish sources. But we have to cover basically 4 things tonight. The first thing we're going to talk about is the death penalty in the written Torah, the thing that we read on Shabbat every week. And I think people come into this class with an understanding that capital punishment is replete, or rather the Torah is replete with instances of capital punishment. Mot yumat, he will be put to death. And certain parts of the Torah that seems to be said over and over again. The second piece we're going to look at are the rabbinic writings, the Mishnah and the Talmud. And we're going to see that the rabbis take a position that perhaps could not be predicted by the emphasis of capital punishment in the Torah itself. We're going to look at some of the medieval codes, and we're going to take a look at modern perspectives of the death penalty. Just going to toggle to the meeting for a second. Okay, I'm going to go back. I'm still getting the hang of this apparatus. Before we look at the individual codes themselves, there's a very general principle that I think we need to have in our minds. And this is basically a good thing to have in mind when one is looking at any sort of historical writing. And this is a general approach to studying legal codes. And this was really suggested to me by one of my teachers at the seminary And his name is Seth Schwartz. But his point is that a legal code, above all, reflects the will of the legislature. It's what the legislature wants. It does not necessarily describe reality. And so when you read a code, you cannot assume that the society that the code is directed to is described by that code. And one very simple example of this is the speed limit. We have a rule that the speed limit is 70 miles an hour or something. And the proposition, the implication is that if you drive faster than that, you'll receive a certain ticket. You will receive a penalty. Of course, we know that the real speed limit is something else. Every road, every jurisdiction has the posted speed limit, what the sign says, but it also has the actual speed limit, which is the point at which you will actually get in trouble for traveling too fast. So there's this distance in every legal system between what the law says, what the will of the legislator is, and what actually is the practice. And we have a very famous example of this taken from the Bible and rabbinic writings. And this is the case of the Ben Sorer Umoreh, the wicked and rebellious son, the rebellious and the gluttonous son. The book of Deuteronomy describes the situation where parents have a son who is rebellious, who is gluttonous, who doesn't listen. And the penalty for this, according to the Torah, is you take the rebellious son out to the city limits and you stone him to death. This goes against not just our basic idea of what justice involved, but this goes against other precepts of the Torah. So when the rabbis look at the case of the wicked and rebellious son, they have a saying, and this saying has crept into modern Hebrew: Lo haya v'lo nivra. It was not and it never was. That the rabbis said that the law of the wicked and rebellious son that the Torah speaks of, that it was never enforced. It never described societal reality. It was simply there to study. It was simply there to make another statement. And so when we look at anything that's a code, we have to remember that we're not necessarily seeing a description of society. We're seeing the prescription of one person or perhaps a group of people, how they felt that society should be ordered. When we look at the death penalty in the written Torah, and once again, I don't think this is a surprise to people who have even a passing familiarity with the first 5 books of the Bible. We find there's a real plentitude of capital offenses. I just have some of them here in the left-hand column. Idolatry, well, that's the death penalty. False prophecy, well, that's the death penalty. Necromancy, we don't want any necromancy. That's the death penalty. Violating Shabbat, death penalty. Sexual sins is a death penalty. Blasphemy is a death penalty. Murder is a death penalty, and so on. This is not in any way an exhaustive list. So capital punishment seems to be widespread in the concerns of the people that wrote the Torah. And we also have in the written Torah different methods of execution. And these are, the rabbis put them into 4. The song says, everyone must get stoned. Well, for capital punishment in Judaism, that isn't true. There's also burning, decapitation, and strangulation. And stoning's number 2 on the list. So we do have we do have at first blush a document that seems to be very attached to the idea of the death penalty and to capital punishment. One way that this is explained is to simply to invoke the context of the times. The Torah does not appear in a vacuum. We don't believe that as a matter of history. We don't believe that as Jews, as religious Jews. We believe that the contents of the Torah are affected by the culture in which they appear. Just like the language of the Torah, Hebrew is the language of where the Jews lived at the time the Torah appears. The laws and customs are affected by the surrounding culture. And two strong sources of laws that parallels to the Torah are well known. The first one is the Codex Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king, famous for his legal code. You see the columns there, it's written in the cuneiform in the little wedge-shaped, the little wedges. And in the Codex Hammurabi, there are laws that parallel in many significant ways laws found in the Torah, particularly Parashat Mishpatim, which we read just a few weeks ago. And we also have the Hittite legal writings. The Hittites were the empire that lived to the north in what we now call Asia Minor or Turkey. They were another regional power. They fought with the Egyptians from time to time. But many people have noted the resemblance between particularly the book of Deuteronomy and the Ten Commandments with legal covenants from the Hittite literature. So one explanation of the seeming fascination of the Torah with the death penalty is this simply reflects the cultural milieu of where it appeared. It would have been unusual for the laws of the Jewish people, the people of Judah, to have been significantly different from the societies that surrounded them. However, there are some instances where people look at the capital punishment in the Torah as being a little bit different than the cultures that surround them. And this is particularly true of parts of the Torah that we associate with, which are the priestly writings, the latest strata of literature that's in the Torah. And this observation was made primarily by a great man, Rabbi Moshe Greenberg, who was a force everywhere he was, at Hebrew University, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and at the University of Pennsylvania. But he made a comparison of the criminal law of the Torah and of the surrounding cultures. And he found that in regards to murder and capital punishment, the Torah is even more uncompromising than the Assyrian, the Babylonians, the Code of Hammurabi, and also the Hittite codes. That whereas in the surrounding codes, you could pay a fine to avoid punishment for murder, or rather the fine would be your punishment, or you could nominate somebody else to stand in your stead to receive the punishment for murder. The Torah does not allow that. This is from the covenant with Noah, Shofech dam ha'adam, ha'adam damo yishafech. That the person who spills the blood of a person, that is to say, somebody who murders somebody, ha'adam damo yishafech, by means of humanity, by means of the human court system, that person's blood shall be spilled. There's no compromise. You can't have somebody else's blood spilt instead of the murderer's. the murderer can't pay a fine instead of being killed. If somebody kills somebody, there has to be an answer that involves that person being killed. In other words, capital punishment. And the Torah in the next verse gives the reason. Ki b'tselem Elohim asa et ha'adam. Because God created man in his image. And Moshe Greenberg connects this part of the Torah with other parts of the Bible, particularly the wisdom literature, and shows that in Israel there was this religious development which saw every human being as being uniquely created by God, and therefore murder cannot be tolerated. And because murder cannot be tolerated, you have to have a judicial system that has the ability to do capital punishment, to kill the murderers. And it is this concern that takes us back to the piece from Sanhedrin, this paradox that a society has to be so intolerant of murder that it has to have the ability to kill the murderer. But by killing the murderer, you're also putting yourself in the position of destroying a unique human being. And so you have this difficult paradox. And you have this tremendous gravity that is attached to the use of capital punishment in Judaism. It was for this reason that man was first created as one person, to teach you that anyone who destroys a life is considered by Scripture to have destroyed an entire world. And anyone who saves a life is if he saved an entire world. It is the inviolability of each individual life that makes capital punishment, according to Greenberg in the later parts of the Torah, and going on throughout Judaism, to be something so terribly difficult. Because we have two imperatives. We have the imperative to make a moral statement that murder is intolerable. And we have the imperative not to destroy a life and to destroy a world. And in the matter of capital punishment, these two imperatives collide with each other. And I'll just stop for a minute and see if there's any questions in the question room. So we will go on. The rabbis have a very different, well, not really different, but as I said in the introduction, the rabbis do not necessarily take the position that one might expect them to take, given the fact that capital punishment is prescribed so freely in the written Torah. You might think that the oral Torah, that the rabbinic writings also would prescribe capital punishment very freely. But very famously, the rabbis were reluctant to, in their legal codes, to have capital punishment imposed. This is a famous Mishnah from Tractate Makot. Makot is the section of the Mishnah that has to do with flogging people, corporal punishment. And it says that the Sanhedrin is a Greek name, but Sanhedrin is a Jewish court. A Sanhedrin that executes once in 7 years is called bloodthirsty. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, even once in 70 years. Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon said, had we been in the Sanhedrin, none would ever have been put to death. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel said, on the other hand, then these sages would have created more murderers in Israel. So we have two views expressed in here. One is a radical reluctance to impose capital punishment. Once in 7 is bloodthirsty. Maybe once in 70 is too much. Maybe it should never happen. And but we have the dissenting view of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel that says, well, there's a reason that we have capital punishment, that a statement needs to be made from time to time, that murder cannot be tolerated. And so a paradox, you have to pick up sides, and the rabbis pick up sides, but by far, the rabbinic literature is understood as being reluctant to impose capital punishment. And they read the oral Torah in a way, they read the written Torah in a way, creatively, to make it very difficult to actually have executions. We have this passage from Makot. Rabbi Yosai says, transgressors are never executed unless his two witnesses are the ones forewarning him, as it is stated, al pi shenayim edim, at the mouth of two witnesses, he is to be put to death shall die. And from this we derive that it is from the mouth of two witnesses that the accused must be forewarned, and forewarning issued by someone else is insufficient. So the written Torah says that there have to be two witnesses in order for there to be capital punishment. Al pi shenayim edim, that the testimony must be in accordance with what two witnesses say. The rabbis in the oral Torah, in the Talmud, translate this literally to make it more difficult to do an execution. Al pi shenayim, not just according to two, but according to the mouth of two. What does it mean to say from the mouth of two? The rabbis say that this means that not only do there need to be two witnesses, but the two witnesses need to warn the murderer before he commits the act that what he is doing is murder, and that the punishment for murder is death. And also, according to the rabbis, the murderer has to answer, yes, I hear you, I've heard your warning, I've heard the warning, and on the condition of receiving this punishment, I'm going to commit the act. Needless to say, this situation is improbable. It's probably hard enough to get two witnesses to a capital offense. And remember that in Jewish law, or be aware that in Jewish law, in capital cases, there's no weight given to circumstantial evidence. You can't use fingerprints. You can't form the case by conjecture and by logic. There has to be eyewitness testimony. And that's hard enough. But according to the rabbis, not only does there have to be eyewitness testimony, but the witnesses have to warn the murderer verbally before he commits the act and make sure he knows what the punishment is. Otherwise, a capital conviction cannot be had under rabbinic law. Needless to say, this makes a conviction even more unlikely to be obtained. And this is evidence of the creativity that the rabbis use in order to prevent executions from happening. Finally, well, not finally, but this is the last one we're going to do this evening, looking at rabbinic attitudes towards the death penalty. There's a really interesting law in Sanhedrin 17a. Rav Kahana says, in a Sanhedrin where all the judges saw fit to convict the defendant in the case of capital law, he's acquitted. So in capital cases, there are 23 judges. And but if all 23 vote to convict the judge, vote to convict the defendant, if all 23 are willing to put their word in for conviction, they have to acquit him, because so much of the procedure for the rabbis is giving the case of innocence the opportunity to be made. That if guilt is so obvious that every one of the judges says he's guilty, in that situation, there's nobody arguing the other side. And if nobody argues the other side, then it can't be considered to be a fair hearing. This is not an adversarial situation like we have in the States where people are hired to pick one side or the other. Everyone here is a judge. Everyone here is committed to the truth. But if no one can truthfully come down on the side of the accused, they are not permitted to convict him because of the commitment towards procedural fairness. The differing stance of the rabbis for capital punishment, if we want to call it differing, from the written Torah, it could flow from several things. It could simply flow from the fact that societies change, that the Torah is written in one environment. The rabbis live in yet a different environment. One thing that scholarship points to in looking at the rabbinic position is that the rabbis were actually powerless to execute anyone. The rabbis did not have their own nation. The rabbis did not have their own authority to hear capital cases. People imagine that the rabbis had rulings over family law, maybe some civil law, but most conquering empires don't let other people do death penalty cases. And that would have been true for the Romans and the Persians. So one view of what the rabbis were doing is that this is a response to powerlessness, that the narrative was adjusted so that the weakness, that the inability of the rabbis to hear capital cases is explained. But I don't think we need to rely on that too much. I think that this is a play out of the paradox, as we saw before, that on the one hand, there's the imperative of the death penalty is just very difficult. You can't tolerate murder. But in order to not tolerate murder, you get into the position of killing somebody, which can be bad for the same reason that murder is bad. In the Middle Ages, the question arises, and we see this both in the Islamic world, where the Rambam lived, and in the Christian world, in Christian Spain, where the Rashba lived. Do non-Jewish rulers have to follow rabbinic teachings on capital punishment? And as we'll see, this is not nearly a theoretical issue. Do we expect the countries that we live under, and this would be a question one would ask of the United States government as well, does the United States government have to follow Jewish law, or should Jews vote for laws in civil society that are similar to laws in Jewish law? And the answer in the Middle Ages seems to be mostly no, that we don't expect non-Jewish rulers, the king, to have the same scruples on capital punishment that the rabbis had. As Rambam writes in his Laws of the Kings, if one person kills another, but without clear eyewitnesses, remember under Jewish law you need 2 eyewitnesses, or without receiving formal warning beforehand, or with only 1 eyewitness, or a known enemy who slays by accident, the king has the authority to maintain order. Literally, and people will love this, l'tachen olam, to heal the world by executing him, as the exigency of the moment demands. The Rashba, writings in Spain. The Torah's procedural rules apply only to the Sanhedrin. But as for the laws of the king, we pay no attention to all that. Royal law is determined exclusively by knowledge of the facts, and therefore one can be executed by royal law based on testimony by relatives or the accused confession without any formal warning, and not by a court of 23. Because, and this is beautiful, if one insists on following the Torah law, as in the process of the Sanhedrin, the world would become desolate, and the murderers and their henchmen would proliferate. In other words, we have to rely on the non-Jewish rulers not to apply Torah. Because if they applied the Torah, we're going to be dominated by murderers and killers. Now, this is probably pretty disheartening. But the fact of the matter is that in Middle Ages, Jewish communities did have, in many cases, a death penalty. They simply used the non-Jewish rulers to accomplish it. They would at times, if there was somebody within Jewish jurisdiction, within the jurisdiction of Jews, that required execution, and we have testimony from other authorities, these people would be turned over to the civil authorities who could do capital punishment, and would be subjected to capital punishment without the safeguards of the Torah. So I just have to do the modern perspectives piece of this, but I want to stop to see if there's any questions at the moment. Okay, we will press on. I find the share button. In modern times, we have the very same issue that Jews had in the Middle Ages. That, again, if we're not living in Israel, we live under non-Jewish authority. And as attitudes towards capital punishment changed in the 60s, there was a need to ask the question, what does Jewish law ask of civil authorities in terms of capital punishment? The person on the left, Harav Moshe Feinstein, Alav HaShalom, the greatest halakhic authority in America, certainly maybe the Western world, in his lifetime. He passed away in 1985. There's, in his volume of responsa, there's a responsa, or his legal opinions, there's a letter which seems to be addressed to a important authority, describing why the Jewish death penalty is so rare in rabbinic law, but also describing about the need for Gentile authorities to potentially go beyond, not really to go beyond, but to go below, to not require the strictures of Jewish law in order to have executions. Simply by logic, it seems that this response was addressed to Governor Hugh Carey of New York, who perhaps asked Rabbi Feinstein for the Jewish opinion on executions, because at that time, I think this was in 1971 when this was written, capital punishment, the viability of capital punishment, well, not the viability, that's a terrible way to put it, but the permissibility, the desirability of capital punishment was becoming more and more under debate in the United States. But also in the Orthodox world, there were very impassioned responses against capital punishment. This one from Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, who wrote this in response to a movement in the Orthodox Union to give a statement endorsing capital punishment. It says, it is irresponsible and unfair to submit a statement in favor of capital punishment in the name of Orthodox Jewry. In my humble opinion, from a halakhic point of view, every Jew should be opposed to capital punishment. It is true that the Torah recognizes capital punishment. However, the Torah delegates the authority to met out capital punishment only to the Sanhedrin, not to anyone else. Even Sanhedrin are not able to met out capital punishment if there is no Beis Hamikdash, that's to say the temple. So this was an impassioned opinion contrary to the writing of Rav Moshe Feinstein, who pointed out why capital punishment was rare in rabbinic courts, but did not go so far as to venture the opinion that for non-Jewish governments, capital punishment should be forbidden, and felt that it, particularly in desperate circumstances, capital punishment could be used. The other two main movements of Judaism in the United States, the conservative movement and the reform movement, both formally oppose capital punishment. In fact, there's a response, a legal opinion, responsum, a legal opinion in the conservative movement arguing that American Jews should be in opposition to capital punishment as it is currently practiced in the United States. Of course, the largest Jewish community in the world today is the state of Israel. And Israel has its own situation. Israel in 1948 inherited the criminal code of the British Mandate. That's the model of government was in Israel. They didn't have time to like innovate a lot of stuff, so they just took what was always there. And the criminal code of the British Mandate had the capital punishment for murder. And there was an execution and for treason. There was an execution for treason in Israel in 1948. And there was a death row in Israel until 1954, which was the time that the death penalty was abolished for murder. The most famous case of capital punishment in Israel is the monster on the left side of your screen, Adolf Eichmann, Ymach Shemo. He was famously arrested in Argentina, brought back to Israel, and tried for war crimes. He was, after a spirited public debate and a debate in the cabinet, he was executed in June of 1961. And Israel is a country that does not have crematoria. The government of Israel, the army, built a special cremation machine. And after he was dead, they burned his body and dumped him in international waters. He was the last execution in the state of Israel. The last death penalty given in the state of Israel was in 1988 to a man named John Demjanjuk, also known as Ivan the Terrible, for war crimes, and that death penalty was overturned, and Mr. Demjanjuk went on to die of old age eventually. But capital punishment in Israel today is reserved for war crimes. There is, however, a movement ongoing to expand the death penalty, particularly in cases, the parts of Israel that are under military law. This is the considering the death penalty for terrorism. As the last government, we don't currently have a stable government in Israel. Elections are underway. The previous government did, in a very close vote, when not a lot of MKs voted, approve on the first reading a bill that would permit this to happen. But there does not seem to be widespread support for doing this at any time in the future. So this is a brief sort of summary of the death penalty in Judaism, covering most of the stages. I want to just sum up that this is, I think, a very difficult issue. I personally am against capital punishment in America, and that's largely for reasons that it's in the Jewish understanding, the death penalty under the rabbis is reserved for the worst of the worst. That there are crimes that are so terrible that society cannot be quiet and permit that person to live. In practice in America, it's not the worst of the worst that get the death penalty. It's people that are really poorly represented, and often, every murder is terrible, obviously. But the application of the death penalty in America, I think, makes it very problematic for Jews to support it. We understand the rationale for it, though, that we have a charge to protect the sanctity of life. And sometimes protecting that can put us into this position of the paradox, where in order to protect the sanctity of life, we could be called upon to kill a person, which in itself imperils the process of that sanctity. I will stop for a few moments and see if there's any questions. So Adam points out that killing cruelly and calmly appears more premeditated and disturbing than the often emotional act. I think that's true. When one is saying somebody is unconditionally bad, they are inferring that society is unconditionally good. you can't judge somebody unless you are free from sin. I agree with all of it, but I think sometimes sometimes you have to. It's even though we're imperfect, we have a stake. We have a stake in protecting the sanctity of life that we have to stand up for. Sometimes we don't deserve to, but I agree with all of your points that racism and class unfairness. It certainly, I think, makes it very difficult as a Jew to support capital punishment in America. It doesn't really the negatives, I think, far outweigh the positives. And they he didn't post publicly, so I won't use his name, but the individual who asked for the class 4 years ago um, wrote a note of gratitude, and you're welcome. I'm glad we finally got to it. And with that, then I will take off. I thank everyone for tuning in. We have a nice crowd on Zoom, and hopefully some people saw it on Facebook, and share the tapes, as they say. Everybody have a good night. Be well.